This is Robert Hutter, and this is the Break It Down Show.
That's right. We are making things happen here today. I'm on the road. I'm up in Seattle, and wanted to make sure I squeezed in the show because the current events right now, man, they're going crazy. I was writing down the intro to the show, and look, when we first were talking about this, a president had been shot, a presidential candidate had been dethroned. And now we have two leaders from two different warring factions have been killed in one in a foreign country. The war in Ukraine continues on for whatever reason. It just goes and goes and goes. And the Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, Houthi conflict continues to add names to the list. Now Iran's flown their red flag if we're scared of that thing. It's crazy around here.
And you are in Seattle thinking about emigrating to Canada.
No, I'd probably go somewhere warmer. I don't want to be.
You better get there before they close the border to Americans.
Yeah. yeah, they will. They're rough to get through. If you make any jokes, they won't. They'll turn you around and be like, "We don't like jokes up here."
There you go.
Yeah. What are your thoughts? Is this just a particularly busy time, or is this business as usual?
Well, let's say right now I'm preoccupied, and I hope most of your viewers are preoccupied with the Olympics in Paris. I mean,
Sure.
It's an extraordinary time. The coverage is better than I've seen it before, even though there were things I would change. But some of the, this Simone Biles, if nothing else, that would make one proud to be an American. And Kathy Ledecky, who actually lives about 10 miles from here, though I don't know where she trains, maybe in the Potomac River, but it's really quite something. And generally in the history of, I raise that because generally in the history of presidential campaigns, there's a time out for the Olympics. And there was a great journalist named James Reston, Scotty Reston, who started out as a sports reporter for the New York Times and became one of our great gurus. He said the American people don't start paying attention to the elections till after the World Series. But that was when there were only 16 teams. And now if you waited till the end of the World Series, you might even have to postpone the election. I'm trying to make a point, which is a lot of what you now see on the media, which is 24/7, particularly the electronic media, isn't worth anything. If a candidate makes some really stupid goof, maybe it will matter. But we have one candidate, Mr. Trump, who continues to say all kinds of outrageous things, I think judged as just an observer rather than somebody with a political orientation. I was going to say alienation orientation. People would say, how could anybody say this kind of thing and run for president? Like going in front of the Association of African American Journalists and saying the Democratic candidate is not even black. And somebody obviously got his schedule card wrong, but and it doesn't seem to matter. So what I would say is, don't believe the polls. There is only one set of polls that matter, and I've done this now. I was in 8 presidential campaigns. I've written speeches. Here comes the bragging. I've written speeches for more serious presidential candidates than anybody else in U.S. history. 3 of whom were or became presidents, and 4 of whom were or became vice presidents. So I've kicked around and still trying to keep from being cynical. But the only polls that matter are the ones that the major outlets do 2 or 3 days before the election, because they want to say we called it. In terms of all the commentary about what's going on in the election, somebody's up this number of points, somebody's ahead in this swing state or not, or even which of the swing states. That is, trust me, people out there, is utterly meaningless. And in fact, there's only one poll that really matters, and that's the one that gets counted on Election Day, November 5th, which this year happens to fall on one of the great British holidays, Guy Fawkes Day. When Guy Fawkes in 1604 tried to blow up the Parliament, I won't make any invidious comparisons to that. Of course, one hopes that this year, however the voting is counted, that both candidates will say, that's it, I accept it. The last time that was not true. And in fact, in 2016, while Hillary accepted defeat, a lot of her people didn't. The first impeachment of Donald Trump, claiming he was somehow a tool of the Russians, was basically about trying to invalidate his having been elected president. So both parties do this. I think the Republican parties tend to be a bit more egregious about it, but it's not like the Democrats are also Simon Pure. So, Mr. Break It Down Show, that's my opening line. Don't believe anything you now see as dispositive about how the campaign is going to come out. Even having said that, the fact that what polls there are tend to say it's more or less equal, et cetera, et cetera. It's that itself is remarkable. Maybe, but not really. When people start focusing, then we'll have a better look at things.
I guess when the polls kind of do matter, and this, I'm not affiliated with either party, and I notice that the parties are awfully into the party's success over maybe the American success. But whoever wins, most of the nation won't want that person to be president. Most of the nation will be against that person. And we've seen this trend for quite a while, where the president starts out below water in approval and remains that way for most of their time there. Maybe there's a peak every now and then where it goes above 50%, but most of us are not going to be happy. And I'm saying us because we're all Americans. And this is the thing that we've gotten ourselves into. And I am disappointed in how the parties do it. And this is just Pete talking, but the party that can't beat Donald Trump just in a square race, shame on them. And the party that can't beat Kamala Harris, a deeply flawed candidate that was rejected by her own party, shame on them. And yet here we are with these two candidates that should be easily defeatable by a legitimate, good candidate that people can get excited about. But we don't have that this time. When are we going to start to see candidates rise who really are something special, that get out of the party and are grabbing the middle, and maybe even some of the opposing parties' voters?
A very profound question. Let me try 2 or 3 ideas on that. First thing you have to understand is we have 51 parties that are Republican, 50 or 51 that are Democratic across the nation. Now, the national parties exist for one purpose and one purpose only, which is to elect the president of the United States. Otherwise, they aren't parties. And in the old days, we spent a lot of time brokering interests, because that's what politics are about. Not foreign policy. That's about actually knowing stuff. But politics is about brokering interests. How do you compromise? This group or these individuals want this, some other people want that. How do you govern? And we've been remarkably successful now since we began this with the Constitution in 1787. First election in 1788, I guess it was, if I remember that far back. One of the problems that's happened recently is we have increasingly personalized the process of election in terms of the person who's at the top. But that person can make a lot of decisions in foreign affairs, but not that many decisions in domestic affairs. And in the economy, and here it comes, everybody out there, the most important person in the American economy of the government, as opposed to the private sector, is the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank. And right now, looking today at the collapse, the last 2 days, the collapse of the stock market somewhat, is because the Federal Reserve did not reduce interest rates. And we'll see what they do next month with regard to interest rates. But presidents say a lot about the economy, and they, at the peril of getting in deep trouble, keep hands off of the Federal Reserve Board, the 10 members of it, but really the chairman who is primus inter pares there. But the issue is governance. So how you do the Senate and House of Representatives is extremely important. Who gets elected? Who runs the particular parties in the two chambers? How they work together or don't work together. When I started out in this, compromise across party lines was the name of the game. Right. Sometimes it was very difficult, like in the working out of the Civil Rights Act, which happened the year before I went to work for 1 year as a kid in the Johnson White House. But then there was the Voting Rights Act the next year where I was there. It required some very tough compromises, but they had some big people who were prepared to do that. You have less of that now, in part because, burden of your question, we don't seem to have the giants, and I think a lot of them were giants back then. For example, health legislation. It would have been harder to find a more conservative senator than Orrin Hatch of Utah. Okay, it would have been harder, at least look from the Republican side, to find a more liberal Democratic senator than Senator Ted Kennedy, who I had the honor of working for 3.5 years. Who got the health legislation done in those days? Orrin Hatch and Ted Kennedy. They got together and said, this is important for the people of the nation. So I'll compromise here, you'll compromise there, and we'll go out together and we'll announce this is what's going to happen because we have influence in our party. You don't have that anymore, or almost never. There are some things that, like there was something about the internet and exposure of children, right? Which passed 97-0 in the Senate the other day. It'll pass handily in the House of Representatives. That's become kind of a motherhood and apple pie issue, but as different. Now, why don't we get better people? Yeah. I think there are a number of things. One is the collapse of civic education in the United States. The lack of a knowledge of history in the United States. The things you ought to know by the time you get out of high school, I don't know whether it's being taught in these fancy private schools, but the public schools are tending to be starved across the nation of the funding that's required. Okay, that's number one, education. Number two is money. The huge amounts of money that you have to, have to raise to run a race. We have up in Maryland, we had a primary race this summer, I think it was for governor, which was the most expensive primary race in the history of the United States. It cost something like $46 million.
Jeez.
In the one party in order to nominate one person. And the guy who put up the most money actually lost. People of Maryland tend to be independent thinkers. Now, most of the money that goes into politics goes, some of it into running staff, paying for the airplane, that you have to have an airplane to take the candidate and from one place to another, candidates from one place to another, people to go and knock on doors, people to go on election day and make sure the other side is not cheating and trying to prevent the other side from seeing that you're trying to cheat. Hey, it's America after all. But the most important thing money goes for is to buy media time, not to produce the ads. That can be done in somebody's basement. It's to buy the media time, which is extremely expensive. There used to be a rule called the Fairness Doctrine, in which if a television station put on Charlie Brown to run and charge a certain amount, they would have to offer the same deal to another candidate. Or if they were doing something free, they would have to do something free for the other. That got killed about 34 years ago. One party decided they had more money and they wanted to get rid of the fairness doctrine. And then he said, oh, but what if we have a third party candidate? Does he or she get left out? That was BS. It was really to keep the money in the game. The amount of money is incredible that goes into this. Now, if you're running for Congress, it depends on where you are. If you're in California, where you usually are when you're not heading for Canada, it's a huge state, huge media markets, and you have to buy into all of them. Los Angeles and San Francisco and everything in between. If you're running in New Jersey, you have to buy both New York and Philadelphia. It's a huge amount of money. Yeah. And the media moguls make incredible profits out of the election campaign. So that's another one. The third element, and you'll notice that I'm looking at this from a politician's point of view. That is, I've had enough time, even though I've never run for anything. I've been appointed to some things, not since I was in college, since I lost that election, so I didn't do it anymore. But I've seen a lot of this. The media is constantly trying to shape opinion 24/7. And the candidates are trying to crack through that barrier that's put up by the various media people, huge media stars who earn $10-15 million a year. Now, some other countries, like you go to Britain, and it's changing now, you have a news broadcast, and the telecaster comes out and says, this is the news at 9 o'clock, read by Charlie Brown. In other words, it's written by somebody else. I'm just the news reader. Don't do that. Right. We haven't done that for a long time. So what you have to do in the campaign is you got to raise enough money to get your media buy. And that means a lot of people who can't raise money don't go into it. I remember a man in Congress named Lee Hamilton. He was a Democrat from Indiana, solid citizen, probably could have won as a nonpartisan candidate, happened to be a Democrat. He became chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, very distinguished, head of the Woodrow Wilson Center later on. He dropped out of Congress. He said, I'm not going to run anymore because to compete, I have to raise $10,000 a week for my entire 2 years in the Congress. He said, that's insane. Yeah. So a lot of people come in who have money that's available to them. And that's another thing about running for office, which is very important. I have had the opportunity to advise more than one person who was thinking about running for president. And I'd say, Mr. Ms., whatever your name is, Senator, Congressperson, understand the following. Listen very, very carefully. Once you declare everything that has ever happened in your life, ever, is going to become public knowledge.
That's right.
There's people out there looking for a Pulitzer Prize who are going to try to pull you down. The media see that as their job. And you had one guy in, I think, the state of Commonwealth of Virginia, who they found out that when he was in college, he did a blackface event. Well, once that was brought out, cost him big time. All of this stuff is going to be brought out. Now, one of the clever things I think that Mr. Trump has done, with all of the outrageous things he's done, is he's done so much of it, nobody knows what to make of it, and a lot of discounted. But a lot of good people just won't run because I don't want to go through that. Put my family through it. Everything is going to come out. Now, every candidate says they're not going to find out about X I did when I was a teenager. Sorry, it's going to happen. So a lot of good people don't run anymore. I'll give you maybe the prime example that we know, at least in my lifetime in the modern era. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a cripple. He was in a wheelchair from the time he got polio in 1920 all the way through the end of his life. He would, when he appeared before the conventions or spoke to Congress, stagger to his feet with heavy braces, be helped along with his son Roosevelt, Elliott Roosevelt. And the American people understood this, but they never saw a picture of Franklin Roosevelt in his wheelchair. And they discounted it. Now, if you have something like that, give you an example the other way. 1972, I go back in that, the McGovern campaign. The Democratic convention was in Miami. McGovern won, and only then, I know this to be true because I saw it happen, just said, hey, I got to have a vice presidential candidate. So they got together in a smoke-filled room, which didn't have any smoke in it, and I said, who do we go? And they said, well, what about Eagleton of Missouri? Not Eagleton. Was it Eagleton? Yeah, of Missouri. And they grabbed him, made him the vice presidential candidate, and about 3 weeks later, the media discovered he'd had some mental problems, and it had some electroshocks. Okay? Back then, that was unacceptable.
Right.
He had to drop out, even though McGovern said, I'm standing 1,000% behind him, showed how much he knew about mathematics. So Eagleton had to get out. And so they went and they got Sarge Shriver to fill in. But that just shows you what it is. So those are the things that keep people from running. Now, I believe personally, one, this is a great nation. Yeah. Two, we are more of a solid nation than you would understand by looking at any of the mainstream media. You start in the community level in this country, people work together. It's the old-fashioned kind of stuff. You go to city council, you go to school boards, except in these places now where they're trying to make politics over what books you can read, what you can't, which is a small beer thing located in a few places, built up by the media. Oh, I got to say another thing. One of the other insidious things has been the rise of the social media. Not that people want to go on and talk to their friends and get on whatever there are, all these Facebook and you name it, or TikTok, but that doesn't really matter that much. Still a limited audience. But then the media, the mainstream media, pick it up and make it national.
Right.
This thing that happened in Pasadena, let's say, in a high school, suddenly becomes a national issue. Even though the rest of the country said, what's that all about? I don't understand. But the media say, because it's, what was the line that the president of CBS once said a couple of cycles ago? If it bleeds, it leads.
Right.
Okay? So there you go.
Yeah.
People try to manipulate things like, I'll give you something instantaneous. Yesterday, fortunately, we had the release of a bunch of prisoners who were held in Russia. Okay. Big moment. Now you unpack that a bit and you say, why did it happen now? And you start unpacking it and you find out there were a couple of reasons. One argument is that Mr. Putin would kind of like to improve his image with some people in the West. But from the American side, it's helped Mr. Biden's image as his presidency comes to an end. And of course, the mother of one of the hostages who wasn't released, who said, hey, Mr. President, what's going on here? My son is not famous, and therefore it's not part of the package. Well, I would say maybe that's so, maybe it isn't. But one thing that was revealed was that in order to get this done, because for whatever reason, Mr. Putin wanted to get a murderer back, a KGB or FSB person in Berlin who shot an opponent of Putin's in broad daylight and then grabbed him right away, threw him in prison. Well, Putin wanted to get him back for whatever reason, or maybe he didn't want the guy talking about things. So what happened? The President of the United States called up, they revealed this, he said, it had been said, called up the Chancellor of Germany and said, would you mind releasing this murderer so I can do a swap? And he apparently said, well, Joe, I'll tell you, it's going to cause problems, but since you asked, I'll do it. Okay, That shows the role of applying to the media to get things done. But again, what I'm getting back to, if you saw it at the community level and at the county level, and in lots of places to the state level, you find some extraordinarily fine people. I would argue, without getting into the question about is there really a Republican Party and what's the Democratic Party doing to itself, et cetera. If you would let me sit down, the two of us could sit down and probably in half an hour identify a better ticket on the Republican side and maybe a better ticket on the Democratic side, who would make a better president.
Sure.
And it would do a better job of running that part of the country, which a president has to do. And I'll make one other point. We have these debates, right? Debates are absolute nonsense.
They're nonsense. Yes.
They're nonsense. Joe Biden dropped out of the run for the presidency in serious part because of the way he performed on that debate with Donald Trump. The first thing that I noticed when he came on, he didn't have any makeup. Come on. And if you've seen Joe Biden in his later things, he's now got a makeup person. Well, he looked washed out. He was also tired. He was overprepared. Well, maybe that's the authentic thing that mean it's a good thing that he's getting out. I can't get into that. That's a kind of a personal thing within his family and the party leaders and all that. But I'll tell you one thing for sure. For sure. A debate between two candidates for president is the last time the winner will ever, in office, if whoever wins, have to do that again. Presidents don't debate. You have a press conference, but if a president can't control a press conference, he or she shouldn't be running for president. The classic ones, of course, ones articulate like John Kennedy or Lyndon Johnson always knew how, when he got a tough question, to make a joke out of it. Or ask, let some reporter ask some stupid question, everybody laughs and you move on. Eisenhower was once asked by his press secretary, how are you going to handle this particularly bad question? He said, don't worry, I'll just confuse them. Okay? But you never have to debate again unless you run for re-election. Now, in Britain, every Tuesday or Wednesday afternoon, the Prime Minister of Great Britain and Northern Ireland appears before Parliament and for X period of time, an hour, 2 hours, has to take direct questions from the opposition leadership who are trying to make him or her look stupid. Right. So you learn how to, it's a skill you have to learn. President have to learn that, except to get elected. Now, there are a lot of other things the president has to have skills, and sometimes we're lucky they have the skills, sometimes they're not. Ronald Reagan got elected for a variety of reasons. One thing, he was fantastically good on television.
Yeah.
You got to give him that. Barack Obama, who I think was an outstanding president, was superb at public presentations. Joe Biden has a stutter. George W. Bush wasn't particularly good, but there were various things. I don't want to use too much of your show just talking about the mechanics of this, but I'm not going to predict the thing. I have a chosen candidate. There are things I want to see done in the nation. I do think we're in deep trouble about the way we're going to manage it, but I also believe, as people say, that the greatness of this country is there. The quality of our people, the things that we get done, particularly in our communities and one another, is astounding. What was the line that one European politician used back in the 19th century? God looks after fools, drunks in the United States of America. And then there was another person who said, I can't remember who it was, you can always rely upon the United States in foreign policy to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. Okay? But we are the most powerful country in the world. We're the most consequential country in the world. And how we do our foreign policy, maybe that's what you want to talk about, is of great consequence.
Yeah, let's close the president part out here in a minute, but when I think about where I'm at, and again, my vote
Think about
belongs
who,
to
please?
me. And what's that?
When you think about who?
Oh, the presidential stuff and who I might vote for. Ultimately, to me, it doesn't matter who the president is because I'm not a party person, and I'm the most important person in my life. The president is barely relevant to me, if they're relevant at all. And look, I'm not saying they're completely irrelevant, but if I go out and I do my stuff and I take care of my community and I do the things I'm doing, this is what you were saying earlier, then the president really Hawks next. This doesn't really matter. And I can be, and this is true for really anybody who chooses to live their life this way. And so we get wrapped up in somebody who we're never going to talk to, is never going to make a decision that really will be very impactful to us. And when they do, it's one in 1,000 things that they do. So we really can in our nation. It's wonderful for that, right? And we do have these amazing, back to your civics point, these founding documents that protect three different, and this is a very unique thing about the United States, is we have these three documents that found our nation, and they protect three individual liberties. You have the Declaration of Independence, which protects us, our freedom, national freedom, like we are the United States, back off. And then we have the Constitution, which protects our political freedom. And then we have the Bill of Rights, which protects our individual freedom. And so these three things work together.
If we apply all these things.
Yeah, depending on how we work these vehicles, but these vehicles are very.
The Supreme Court will let us apply these things.
Sure. Or if the states, in conjunction with how the Supreme Court and if the Congress and all these different people, for sure. But we do have these documents that allow for our system to be fairly robust and protect us from the worst of ourselves and be able to kind of just go forward reliably, in a good direction. I mean, here we are looking around. We are the biggest country, and we do tend to do the right thing over time. We make a lot of dumb mistakes, and we should get better at these things. We, for whatever reason, are revisiting racism at some level that makes no damn sense. I thought we'd gotten past a lot of that stuff, but we're choosing as a nation to dig back in and get back into it. Oh, all right, let's have these conversations. And they're not good conversations, right? We're kind of designed to be a big fat argument all the time. But yeah, I mean, the president sort of matters, and I would stand next to either of the people who are candidate right now and be like, I have better character. I have more integrity. I'm more honest than either of you. But I also don't want that job. I don't want that job. It's a horrible job because we treat, as you were saying, we treat the president terribly. They'll be fantastically wealthy at the end of office. Everybody who gets elected at the federal level seems to get fantastically wealthy. And I don't know what we do about that, but it just makes me further removed. I don't even feel disenfranchised. I just don't think that my federal vote matters a bit. I just don't. I've just become apathetic about it because there's no reliable direction, and I just see it being very it serves itself, and that doesn't serve me. And so I go out and take care of my own things, and my life improves the less I pay attention to the news and the less I pay attention to politics.
Yeah, but a lot of what's done in Washington is going to impact on your life, whether you like it or not.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, Social Security, health system, education system, the railroads, the mail, the military. I could go on and on and on. There's an awful lot of stuff that's going to matter, whether we have a healthy economy or not have a healthy economy. How much inflation there is, that depends more upon supply chains and the Fed and interest rates and all that. So you can't escape. You can run, but you can't hide.
And I'm not saying it has zero effect, right?
Pardon?
I'm not saying it has zero effect, but I am saying that if I choose to live my life and be the most important person in how my life runs, then it's going to be hard for some person in DC to be all that impactful. Sure, policy may scooch over a bit on railroads to create more or less, but we have the most railroad in the world. We have the most. We move the most stuff on rail, and maybe we'll move more stuff on our waterways. And will that impact me? Maybe not. And I'll let them know if it does. Inflation for sure matters, but we've been spending a lot of money and printing a lot of money. We've all known inflation was coming. Here it is. Which president hasn't spent a lot of money? Yes, please.
If I'm making a case for government, a lot of what you're saying, and I might agree with a lot of it, works more for people who are white, middle class, and are not deeply affected by the ups and downs of the economy. Certainly not about opportunities to get a
Right.
decent education, to have parents who are not on drugs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And frankly, we're better off being males than being part of the majority who are females. One thing I happen to like very much is we have a woman running for president. Hillary ran for president. She was probably not the best person to run for president. That's another matter. But I hope I happen to support the Democrat. I'm not entirely a yellow dog Democrat. I'll support any, but I will be honest. You probably can tell. I want Ms. Harris, Vice President Harris, to get elected, and part of that is because it's time to have a woman in the top office. I like the idea of women in the Supreme Court. I like all the women are now in the Congress and in the media, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's been a long time coming, and it's been moving quite rapidly. To think of all the time
Yeah.
when that was just not true at all. And a lot of that can be debated. Now, let me shift a little bit more to the election. I'm going to say another truism. People almost never vote for a candidate for president on the basis of foreign policy. Maybe if there's a question of war and peace, or maybe in 1968 when people were worrying about Vietnam one way or another, which affected a lot of people and certainly got a lot of attention. The way in which Vietnam was handled in the 68 election had an impact. I was writing speeches for Hubert Humphrey, and he came around on the side of working to end the Vietnam War. And the guy who was against ending the Vietnam War won the election and kept us there for a number of 5 years, okay? But generally, people don't vote on this basis. There are some niche issues in which this matters. For example, right now, as we saw with the war in Gaza, which is having an impact domestically, we saw that with the protests on campus this last year, which were handled by different university administrations in different ways. We also had the impact on various universities of people giving money or withholding money. There were 3 college presidents who had to leave because of this factor. Harvard, Columbus, and Penn. These are not inconsequential places. And because of the way they were perceived by some people to have handled these issues inadequately. I will make you an absolute prediction. Here's a prediction. When the kids come back to campus, we're going to see encampments again. We're going to see strong protests again. In not just, I don't think the issue will have died out by then. It doesn't look like it will have died out. And there are divisions within body politic among younger people. But also, the Prime Minister of Israel made it worse for this issue in our campaign when he spoke to the Congress of the United States last week. And he said the people who opposed what Israel is doing in Gaza, in particular the people on campuses, were useful idiots. Well, that's a term that goes back to the Cold War and to Lenin and everybody else who say we communists are going to use all these I mean, that was just an amazing thing. If you wanted to throw gasoline on a fire on campus, if anybody was paying attention about surfboarding, that's going to be something. But in general, the one thing people, I think, in general, look for is the following. Can the President of the United States, who's going to be elected, keep us safe? Keep the nation safe. And what's my standard of judgment? I look at this person and I say, could that person be the commander-in-chief? I invented the term the commander-in-chief test. It's not how you speak about foreign policy issues. It's how your demeanor. For example, I would say Ronald Reagan, who had 0 foreign policy experience, passed the test when in the New Hampshire primary, he got into a fight and he said, I paid for this microphone. And people said, good for the giver. Okay. I've seen various times like that. Some people run and they don't look like they're going to be strong. George McGovern didn't look strong. And yet, of every modern president, going back, I think probably to Ulysses S. Grant, George McGovern had more combat experience. He flew bombers over Germany way past the number you're supposed to fly. He was a genuine hero.
Yeah.
And yet nobody saw him as a potential, or not enough people saw him as a potential president. Okay. So it's the commander-in-chief test. And you pass it by how you look. Now, I'll say one thing about Mr. Trump. He comes across to a lot of people as somebody who would kick a bad guy in the rear end. Okay? He comes across like that. And I think a lot of people say, I can vote for him. I don't care about the issues. I don't care about what's happening in Israel. I don't care what's going to happen in Ukraine. And one of the remarkable things, he can say, I got along with Kim Jong-un of North Korea. He's kind of a buddy, and we're going to be buddies again. He said that yesterday. And a lot of people say, well, so what? What does North Korea impact on my life? The answer is it doesn't impact it at all. Now, issues of war and peace do matter, and presidents are very important. But I think the important thing for a president in this, and actually doing it, is recognize first, the world does not care whether we have a Republican or a Democrat president. The world goes about its own business. They look at how the United States behaves. Sometimes the things that are said by our leaders are the things we do. Right. If it's a Republican doing it or a Democratic doing it. Now, we're trying to, in the Democratic Party, trying to manipulate things that Mr. Trump has said about his relationship with Putin, or things he said about NATO. I don't think he'd get us out of NATO. And I think a lot of things that were said about him with regard to Putin were blown out of proportion. When the Democrats went to try to impeach him over Russia, I said, that's a stupid thing to do. All that does is help Trump, and it did. And then when the material on the Russian role in our election in 2016, which was minuscule, didn't work, they then moved over to Ukraine because the objective of the Democrats was to get rid of Trump. It looked like a good issue. So, but in this, I think Biden has been very smart with Ukraine. We've had this war going on, still going on. It's going to go on for a while. But his fundamental thing was two things. One, I need to keep the allies together. So I get the resonance back from allies, and it's going to work. And secondly, no Americans get killed in Ukraine. Give them weapons, but not so much in terms of weapons that it might escalate the war, not so much that they could take the war, the Ukrainians, deeply into Russia, where Putin would have no excuse, would have no choice to come back. So people would say, why don't you do more? And he could say, and the average American who pays attention, he kept us out of war. Kept us out of war. Yeah. Sometimes that works. 1916, Woodrow Wilson ran on partly the thing, I've kept us out of war. And a year later, we were at war, okay? In 1964, when I worked for Lyndon Johnson for that 1 year, and I was in Atlantic City for the convention, Goldwater was the nominee, as you remember. And one of the arguments was, Goldwater is going to drive us more deeply into Vietnam. All right, so he lost. Johnson won, and guess what? We got more deeply involved. Deeply, yeah. Okay, so what matters of war and peace matter. But the key thing with the president is to say this, okay, I know I'm good at this. I'm good at being a strategist about foreign affairs. Mm-hmm. I think we've had two presidents since, let's say, Eisenhower ran a war, who've been very good at this. And as a Democrat, you're going to recognize who I'm saying, Richard Nixon and George H.W. Bush. They both used their 8 years as vice president effectively. Nixon knew about as much foreign policy as almost any president we've had. George H.W. Bush had been vice president. He'd been UN ambassador. He'd been ambassador to China, and all of it. He knew a lot of stuff. Right?
Yeah.
Here's his son George W. Bush, when he was elected, except to go to Mexico, had been outside the United States exactly 3 times in his entire life. And one was a 2-week holiday in Britain. Okay. And he said, we're going to have a softer, gentler thing. But that's number one. Know what you're good at, but hire other people to do the rest. But the most important thing after that, most important, is for a president to hire people who know what they're doing. In domestic politics, you have to broker interest. So you get somebody at the Department of Commerce who can work with industry. You get somebody at the Department of Labor who can work with labor. You get somebody at the Health and Human Services or Health, whatever it's called now, who can work with that constituency, et cetera. You're constantly brokering interest across the nation. Foreign affairs, it's understanding the world, understanding our interests, and finding people who can think their way through that and get it done. Recent presidents have not done that, have not chosen the best people who have this kind of brain power and experience, both academic experience and experience in government, the two which go together. It's a requirement which was first invented by a man named Aristotle, but that's another matter. For example, I would argue the following. State Department is good at exercising diplomacy. It's not terribly good at thinking about over big policies because of the way they do their business in terms of homogenizing everything. They tend not to be very good at it. The focus for making American foreign and security policy is in the White House, and specifically with the National Security Council staff, the National Security Advisor, and the President of the United States. Now they have to gather all the best thinking and interest and everything else from the rest of the government. And there's a process which has been going on now for 50 years, which tends to work pretty well. I won't, Jimmy, burden your listeners with this, but they can look at it up. It's called the NSC system. You can look it up. I can name for you 3 outstanding national security advisors with this function. You may not like all their policies, might not, but they knew how to do it. Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and Brent Scowcroft. Now, Brent was less a strategist than he did the other thing that a national security advisor has to do, is pick good people, really good people. Not just because some senator says, I got to take care of Charlie here or something like that. Some will come out of the bureaucracy, state, defense, CIA, civilian, military, really good people. Some will come out of academia, really good people. And we have tended not to do that for some time. Part of it was at the end of the Cold War, a lot of people said, we won. We don't have to think about the world very much. We won. I argued at the time, and it's been proved over and over again, that's the time when you have to do more thinking, not less, because you can't rely upon all your allies to follow along after you, because you're confronting the big bad wolf in Moscow who's got nuclear weapons. So you have to do more thinking, and the irony is we've done less. So you have these 3 characters I mentioned who had outstanding staffs, and they were also small.
No.
Those 3 national security advisors had, and I served all 4 years under Carter, working for Zbigniew Brzezinski. That's 2 hours and 20 minutes. Right. And we had the professionals, civilian, military, government, non-government. We had a total of 60 people. That meant everybody had to be able to think across an entire region and also had to be able to think presidentially. If I'm going to be presenting ideas to the president, I've got to think about what does he need to know? What are the issues he needs to know? What are the choices I need to present to him? Guess how many people are on the National Security Council staff today instead of 60? God.
Yeah.
600. 600. That means there's nobody who thinks across a particular region. There's nobody who's taxed to think presidentially. Oh, that's above my pay grade. That'll, by the time that gets up a level, it gets to the national security advisor. Instead of what we had to do under those 3 national security advisors, we had to come up with things that were worthy of the president, choices worthy of the president, so he could be president. Now he can just pass the buck, and and so one thing I would require, I don't know whether Trump is open to this, but I'll let other people decide that. What I would require of Ms. Harris is use this time intelligently to find somebody to help her find the people that could help her govern in foreign affairs. Domestic, you can wait till afterwards because a lot of us dealing with reconciling interests. Foreign affairs, people who know stuff, know how to do it. Now, she will, before inauguration, will be handed a list of people to appoint. Because the establishment, and I'm older than that, but I spent decades as a card-carrying member of the establishment.
Yeah.
Have their own candidacy. They figure out, it's your turn, that turn, let's do this. You can get this, and here's we put the, and they will give her a group of people to put in jobs. And if she takes that as a given, she's stupid. What you do in this period, I believe, is you hire somebody who doesn't want a job and say, you go out and pound the pavement, find out who really knew how to do this. And don't just take those people who are given to you. I won't name the various think tanks and institutions who are all competing for these jobs, who may or may not know what they are doing. They think they do, and maybe in some things they can. But unless you have this central capacity, the President of the United States will fail the nation. It's an iron law. I wrote a book on this back after the Carter administration, and Ben Scowcroft wrote the introduction because he said that's it. That's how it has to be done. They're iron laws. The only thing a president has to do in the campaign is look presidential, commander-in-chief. Don't say something stupid. Learn enough about enough things so you can handle what you have to handle in the debate on basic things about keeping the nation safe. How do you handle human rights? What do you do about X and Y? And on this time, you're going to have answers for Ukraine and answers for the Middle East. Answers for the Middle East, and particularly Gaza, and because of the way it's being handled, Iran, you're going to have answers. But don't overload yourself with detail. That's one reason that Biden looks so bad. He'd been overtrained. And he had all this stuff in his head, whereas Trump had a few things, and he got them out. I remember one thing that came up with, I think it was with Reagan. Somebody wants to ask him, who is the Prime Minister of India? And he, in fact, said, I don't need to know who the Prime Minister of India is. Maybe when I become president, it'll be somebody else, and I'll have somebody to ask. Somebody else I have it. Don't ask me a stupid question like that. And everybody says, bravo. Don't ask him stupid questions. Ask him things that will keep me safe. Now, will Ms. Harris do this between now and the election? I guarantee she won't.
Yeah.
And she will be the prisoner when she is about to become president after, if let's say she's elected, between that short period between November 5th and January 20th, not that long, to frame who's going to be in these particular jobs. Now, the same thing happened with Obama, okay? He made 2 public statements. One was a long interview with the Atlantic magazine. Another was a speech to the cadets at the United States Military Academy. You can look it up, it's on the record. And he said, one of the problems in this job is very often I am handed a solution that's a military solution for whatever the problem is. He said, I am put in the position that, Mr. President, the tool you have is a hammer, so everything's going to look like a nail.
Right.
And I said to him all the time, Mr. President, you understand don't you change some people? He didn't change anybody to find some people who didn't think everything looked like a nail. Now, what I'm saying is actually pretty simple, but it's very difficult to get a candidate to understand, to break free of the consensus that's going to be handed him or her. The consensus is worked out in part to box in the president in things that need to be done, but even more, who's going to get the jobs.
Right.
And the chances under either person right now of getting somebody who's really a top-notch national security advisor, right now I don't rate it very highly. And I'm not self-serving because I like my naps too much in the afternoon to take the job.
I love being that.
There was a time I might have been able to do it, but not now. Now, I'm sure this is not. And here's another thing.
Yeah.
Foreign policy for the balance of the campaign has shut down. We're not going to do anything different on Ukraine. There is a thing that is going to have to happen. At some point, there's going to have to be a negotiation. I could define its terms. I could define the methodology, but it's not going to happen until the next president. Because whatever the president does, the current president, and his vice president who's running does, they're going to get hammered for it. That's the way the game's played. Another area, nothing is going to happen in regard to Gaza. That requires the president of the United States to take a strong stand. Now, there is an article, miraculously, in the New York Times this morning, where the mainstream media has not touched a lot of these things. Incidentally, the speech given by the Prime Minister of Israel last week was a disgrace. The fact he was invited, and some of the things that he said, if we followed them, we would be in a war with Iran tomorrow morning. Go and look at the speech. Did you see full coverage of it? No, he didn't cover it. But finally this morning, the day we're talking, it's the 2nd of August, there is an op-ed in the New York Times for the first time in which the op-ed writers are saying the president needs to tell Netanyahu to stop the war. And I would say that's not going to happen. The one thing the president needs to demand is a full opening of the borders with Israel and with Egypt and a fantastic flood of humanitarian aid. Now, the Prime Minister of Israel got up and said, oh, they got all the aid they need for humanitarian. It's just Hamas that's doing. That was a paraphrased, what's the word? Economical with the truth, all right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but that's the one thing I think the president can do. Otherwise, the killing is going to continue. The slaughter is going to continue. The pressure and Iran's doing bad things. Hezbollah is doing bad things. The Houthis are doing bad things. Hamas, of course, is doing bad things. Lots of people out there are doing very, very bad things, pushing in directions that could lead to war. And if there's a war with Israel, we're in it. Okay? If there's a war with Iran, we're in it. There's no question about it. We're going to have our interests. And right now, sensible people will avoid war. But are people always sensible? There may be some historians in your audience. I went to Sarajevo, that's in Bosnia, in 1971, and I stood in the footprints with in concrete at that point, where a man named Gavrilo Princip stood on the 28th of June 1914 and killed the Austrian Archduke, the heir to the throne, and we had the worst war in human history to that point. Well, so people are not always so sensible. And right now, I won't say it's on a hair trigger, but to avoid a war in the Middle East between now and X period is going to depend on a lot of people. Lots of people. The Iranians, the Israelis, the Americans, the Hezbollah, the Syrians, the people down in Yemen, etc., all being sensible. Now, I don't know how many people, the worst form of government I've ever heard of is a homeowners association. okay,
Oh my God.
in which
Yeah.
nobody has common interests. Everybody just thinking about themselves. Well, right now, the situation in the Middle East is like a homeowners
It
association.
is so
We're
bad. Yeah.
expecting everybody to do the rational thing. Now, I'm not trying to scare people, but I'm just trying to say right now, because we have a vice president who's running for president, who's therefore tied into what the administration does, and we have these two issues which are hot wars. I haven't even talked about China because nobody's going to care about China between now and the next
Right.
administration. Ukraine and Gaza and elsewhere around there. These are issues that are basically fundamentally stuck in our politics and are going to be exploited. Now, Mr. Netanyahu has to deal with his nation's security, okay? That's his job. That's what he gets paid
Yeah.
for. But he knew and he knows that he has free play between now and the election, that neither candidate or the president is going to tell him boo.
Right.
So
Yeah.
Mr. Trump, when he was president, let Israel do everything it wanted to do. And Mr. Biden has let Israel do everything it wants to do. Well, I'm not going to say whether that's right or wrong in policy terms. I happen to think it was extremely dangerous and has damaged our reputation in the world in a way that has not been damaged since Vietnam or maybe the Iraq invasion of 2003. But Mr. Netanyahu now knows he has free play.
Yeah.
Because there's nobody who has the guts to stand up and risk defeat at the polls. Now, I mentioned another thing that is important, which is going to be involved in the fall thing. As you've seen, there are some so-called swing states that have a lot of Arabs, a lot of Palestinians, and a lot of people who support Israel. Some are Jews, some just support Israel for historical reasons. I happen to be a strong supporter of Israel's security, and some are evangelical Christians because they see Israel's importance in the end of time. Okay, but so there's a balance, and so the candidates, particularly the Democrats, are having to calculate what do we do in regard to Gaza, and what are we going to do in regard to the encampments and all of that, so we come out with a balance that's going to help us get the electoral votes of 3 or 4 states in the Midwest, which may well determine the election.
Yeah.
It's tough. And it's tragic. It's tragic that we are now prisoners of people in the Middle East.
Yeah.
Out of war. We are prisoners of our political system in regard to the Middle East, of being able to do things that might make sense in American foreign policy. It's not the first time it's happened. It used to be back in the 50s, the so-called China lobby.
Oh,
If you weren't a Chiang Kai-shek against Mao Zedong, you were beyond the pale, and you're probably a commie. Look at what
That's right.
McCarthy and all these other people your listeners never even heard of did to destroy the State Department, destroy millions, dozens of careers, get people thrown out of Hollywood, all this stuff, for destroyed careers. Well, we're in a situation like now with it's not as bad as it was in terms of career destruction as it was in the 1950s, the China lobby. But we have lobbies today which are very important. Some get controlled, like the Irish lobby ain't what it used to be, in part because some 4 leading Irish senators, Kennedy Moynihan, Governor Kerry, and Tip O'Neill, got together as they call themselves the 4 Horsemen, and they brought under control the IRA supporters in the United States and broke the back of the Irish lobby. Well, we don't have that choice now. But if I were right now Biden and Vice President Harris, I would be losing sleep about how to manage these things. particularly that one where I really don't have control because of the 5 players in the Middle East, big players. Ukraine,
Yep.
there's not going to be a breakthrough. There's not going to be this. There's not going to be that. That's more or less going to be under control in the election. It may sound cynical, but that's the way politics are done in our country. The way politics are done.
Yeah, I guess let's wrap up on this. And I know you're honest about these things, so I'll be interested to see what you say.
I've been very candid, and I'm going to be in deep trouble. But let me tell you, on my basic perspectives of foreign affairs, how it's run, what the issues are now, I don't know any honest expert who would disagree with what I've said.
Yeah,
I know a lot of dishonest experts who've drunk the Kool-Aid of one side or another.
Oh yeah, sure.
Who disagree with me.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and if it wasn't you talking, when I hear the stuff that's anti-Netanyahu, this is not because I'm pro-Netanyahu, but I always ask the question, when does the politics stop and Netanyahu start, right? Because that's a fair criticism, because we get ourselves wrapped up in what Israel ought to do, and it's partisan a lot of times. But I don't want to get distracted by that. What I want to ask you
I just have to say again, basically,
please.
Netanyahu has to do what's best for Israel. I don't happen to think some of the things are best for Israel, and also not best for the United States. But that's another matter.
Yeah. And Israel's going to continue to kill people in other people's countries. That's going to happen. And that's what they do.
And Israelis are going to continue to get killed, but in smaller numbers. I mean, as we speak, Iran, because of the murder of the person from Hamas who was most likely to do a deal, they deliberately killed him rather than somebody else. Just as they deliberately killed the guy in Beirut. Okay, that's far less consequential. But at this point, Iran has said, we're going to have to do something. We have said we're going to do what we can to prevent aerial attacks. But I'll tell you, the next period is a hold your breath period. I mean, the Iranians don't want a war. Netanyahu doesn't want a war. None of these
we don't know how this killing happened, but if it did involve a jet, it definitely has our influence in that thing too.
Well, it's maybe not. It's an embarrassment for the Iranian leadership because there was a planted bomb, and that had to be done by insiders. Okay.
Yeah, well, there's that too.
It's done.
Let me ask you this.
That's small beer. That's tactical and daily compared to the larger problem that right now we are stuck. We, the United States of America, the big enchilada in the Middle East, not in control of what might happen in the next few months. Hezbollah, the Syrians, the Houthis, the Iranians, Hamas, the Israelis, each have more control over the future than does the President of the United States.
Yeah. And when we actually know the actual story of how that dude died and everything else, and maybe we know now, but these things tend to change. And I've seen these stories change. We don't even know what happened with President Trump's assassination attempt. We don't even know what happened there. So these stories change. I want to ask you this question to really close out. And I don't want to hear about ethnicity. I don't want to hear about gender. I want to hear about actual professional credentials. And I want a positive thing that maybe we haven't considered about Vice President Harris, and a positive thing about President Trump on why we might want to consider them. And then a thing that you wish that they were better at, not like a negative thing, but like, I'd love to see them improve this part of who they are. If either of them ultimately, and heck, it's so crazy right now, maybe neither of them is the candidate in 100 days. Who even knows what's going to happen? It's been so crazy because there's not going to be some twists and turns. So one thing that's professional about each person that's good, and one thing that you'd love to see them improve about either of those people.
How long do we have to talk about it?
As long as you want, man.
The two parties, at least domestically, do present different approaches to what we're going to do domestically at home. There's serious choices. Hopefully, whichever party is in power will have the kind of compromise in the Congress that we used to have. That's important because neither side can have all it wants. doesn't have the money, doesn't have the support, blah, 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 blah. There are different views. And some issues are more important than others, like on healthcare. It's much more important difference of view on that kind of thing. That's number one. Number two, I would like to see greater presentations by both candidates that they are doing the kinds of things that would lead them to be president and give confidence to the American people that we've elected people who can meet the fundamental needs. That's, believe it or not, in terms of their demeanor, is less important in domestic affairs, because they're, no matter which party wins, they're still going to have to deal with certain kinds of issues, all right? And they're still going to have to do the same kind of bargaining. I'm more concerned to have confidence that whichever one becomes president, they're going to hire sensible people and do sensible things that will advance the interests of the United States. Both of them are very intelligent. Look, Mr. Trump, I credit him with being brilliant. He's brilliant.
Yeah.
I think Harris is extremely intelligent.
Oh, no, Harris is.
And this is live.
I'm sorry.
And I hope that will come. That was my wife kibitzing. It's right. She's a voter too, you know. So, but
Yeah.
I'll let her do the next show.
And your dog's a voter.
And the dog is not a voter. That's your income.
Oh,
That's what I hope for. Now,
Yeah.
all that simply because we might get him as president.
Right.
Well, some of the things that Trump is doing are helping the Democrats immensely, because independents are going to saying, what the hell is going on here? But I would like him to tone things down and get more in terms of, here's how I'd actually run the country, rather than the kinds of things about, was Obama born in the United States?
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
is Harris a black and
Right.
an Indian, or is she all
It just
gender politics and all this kind of stuff? I would like all that kind of stuff. You know, he is the nominee.
Yeah.
He's nominated, and he has a good chance of being president of the United States. And I don't personally think, as a political animal, believe that a lot of things that he says and does are going to increase his chances of winning the election. Now, in particular, that he's got a young candidate against him who's got a lot of energy. But as to who's going to get elected in November, I'm going to hope for the best. And I hope that whichever gets elected is going to put the United States of America and its people first. That's what we pay them to do.
Yeah.
Not the nation, which is not at all as divided as a people as the media would have us know.
Oh, that's totally true.
It's
You're right
just
about
not
that.
true. It's just not true.
Yeah.
I mean, we are fundamentally a patriotic people. I mean, you look at the Olympics. When any one of our people win, look at the reaction of not only the people there, they wrap themselves in the American flag because they're representing the United States of America.
Yeah. And I'm proud of them, all of them.
I'm proud of them.
Yeah.
This is, and then you go around the individual communities. You look at the average person. You look at the kind of education that most people get, though there are a lot of holes in it, etc. This is an amazing country, And I think both Biden, Harris, and Trump would all fundamentally agree on that, but are running different tactics to get various different kinds of things put forward. I am confident that we will rise above whichever person is elected that a large part of the electorate wished had not been elected.
I hope everything goes the way you hope it goes. That would be good. All right, let me roll these credits. I'll be right back to say goodbye to you.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you so much